I would like to welcome you to the Historic Garment District Museum of Kansas City. And today we have a recording being made of our museum. We are going to be closing this museum in a week, and which is bittersweet to us. It is part of our larger collection at the Kansas City Museum, and so it will continue at the Kansas City Museum. But by having it where we are today, we are at 801 Broadway, right in the exact center of what was once the second largest garment manufacturing district in the entire country. And this map on the wall here is what the neighborhood looked like just before World War I. And it is a federally designated historic district, so it does have defined boundaries. It's Washington Street on the west to Wyandotte Street on the east, north to 6th Street, and down to 10th Street to the south. This encompasses nearly every garment business that was in Kansas City, with two possible exceptions, and that would be the Donnelly Garment Company, or Nellie Don. They were a little bit south of here, about 6 blocks, and the Lee Jean Company, or H.D. Lee Company, which was about 12 blocks south before they moved to the Lenexa, Kansas area in the 1950s. But other than that, this district includes all of those other businesses. The garment district really took off as a manufacturing district right after World War I. There was a handful of men who immigrated from Eastern Europe after World War I. And while they were living in Europe, they had clothing companies or tailoring businesses. They were used to working with garments. When they came to the US, they went to New York first because that was the center of textile clothing manufacturing. But there was a lot of competition. So they started looking around the United States, looking for a good place where they could go and create their own district, their own community. And when they looked at Kansas City, this is what they saw. The various businesses listed here, there are quite a few dry goods companies, there are millinery supply companies, there were companies here that were selling the raw materials for making clothing. By locating their clothing manufacturing businesses here, it saved them money on shipping in their material goods. In terms of selling what they were making, both Montgomery Ward's and Sears they each had a very large distribution center in Kansas City at that time. And Kansas City, then as now, is the second largest railroad transportation center. The amount of trains that go through Kansas City right now every day, there are a few passenger trains, but most of them are shipping merchandise, shipping goods. And if they were shipping goods out, they started selling to the businesses that were in small towns, Russell, Kansas, Beatrice, Nebraska, Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I mean, they were going to the states right around Missouri. Until then, the only place where those stores were getting their ready-to-made clothing was coming from New York. And it cost more to ship to Russell, Kansas than it did to Columbus, Ohio, for instance. So by also putting their businesses in Kansas City, they were getting a ready-made market. If I owned a clothing store in Russell, Kansas, I could order the goods that I wanted to sell, I could order them from Kansas City and pay just a fraction of the cost that I would pay to have them shipped all the way to New York, or all the way from New York. So it really made good business sense. So they started building their businesses here, and by the 1950s, at any one time, there were between 70 or 80 businesses operating within the garment district. By 1984, there were only 2 businesses left, and both of those closed that year. There were a number of reasons for the decline, and it's kind of like the decline of the Roman Empire. There are a lot of theories and a lot of arguments, a lot of reasons that people put out, but the fact is it was just the culmination of all of these things happening at once. In the garment district, originally, the people who worked here all lived near here. Just to the west, just to the east, in Columbus Park, in the northeast neighborhood of Kansas City. They were all kind of local. Or also over coming in from the Kansas side, coming up the streetcar and the 8th Street, coming up here on the streetcars. In 1957, Kansas City got rid of the streetcar system. The bus system wasn't as developed yet, and people were moving out to the suburbs in the 1950s. They were moving out of these neighborhoods. They were building up in Raytown and Independence and Lee Summit and Overland Park and over in more places in the Johnson County side, building up towards Liberty. They weren't staying in the core of Kansas City anymore. So they couldn't necessarily drive to work because the parking in 1957 was worse than it is in 2024. And there were no parking lots. There wasn't a lot of on-street parking. There were no parking garages necessarily. The people who were working down here, they didn't have a way to get here, and if they did have a way to get here, they didn't have a place to park. So it became a little difficult to find employees. You had some of that. You also had the gentlemen who had started these businesses in the 1920s were wanting to retire. Their children were not necessarily interested in running a factory. They had other things to do. They had grown up in the United States. They had been able to participate in good education. You had college-educated people who were becoming doctors and lawyers and college professors, and they didn't want to work in a clothing factory or run a clothing factory. So a number of these gentlemen, they just closed their businesses, retired, moved to Florida. And I say that there are somewhere between 50 and 60 or so oral histories that were done between 2000 and 2002. Those oral histories were done with people who worked in the garment district, anybody ranging from seamstresses to company owners. Those interviews were video interviews, and they're all at the Kansas City Public Library, and they are all available online. If you go to kclibrary.org and you search on Garment District, you'll bring those up. You can either watch the video interview or they have the transcripts too. And I'll never forget, there is one in there, and it's a gentleman who I believe was in his 90s when the interview was done, and he was so matter of fact. Well, I just decided one day I was tired of winter, I wanted to retire, and I just moved to Florida. Just closed the door. And that's what a lot of the businesses did. In the early 1970s, the United States opened up trade relations with China. So what that did, it severely hurt the garment industry, the electronics industry, the automotive industry to a certain extent, the steel industry. It really hurt some of the industries in this country, particularly those that had unions, that had labor employees, where they were actually taking care of their employees. They may be taking care of them because they were union members, but they were being paid more than the people who were working in Asia, in China. If I was a store owner in 1975 and I wanted to buy dresses to sell in my store, and I'm kind of making up the numbers. Say I paid $1 for a dress I bought from China and I sold it for $10, I made $9 profit. Or I could buy a better quality dress made in Kansas City for $5 and sell it for $10. So it kind of comes down to numbers too. There also was a rise starting in the 1960s of discount retailers. You had Walmart, Kmart, Target, Venture, Dollar General. You had a lot of stores that were selling clothes, selling other items at discounts. So they were looking for cheaper, more inexpensive merchandise to sell in their stores. So if they're selling, then they're selling the dresses for $6, people are going to go and get a dress for $6 versus going to Penny's or Sears or Macy's or someplace and paying $10. It started coming down to numbers. Kansas City, the companies here just couldn't compete with the prices. They always competed with the quality, but they could not compete with the prices. So just eventually, the businesses started going by the wayside. By 1984, there were two companies left, Phil Jacobs and Fashion Built. They managed to hold on a little bit longer because they were specialty companies. Fashion Built specialized in quality women's coats. Coats have always been something that a lot of people are willing to pay a little bit more for, because when you buy a coat, it's going to last you more than 1 year, more than one season. And so they also sold their coats, they were sold also at higher end retailers. They weren't being sold at the Walmarts and the Targets and the Kmarts at the time. And then you had Phil Jacobs. Phil Jacobs was a maternity wear company, and there were very few companies that specialized in maternity wear. But even then, so you had the coats, people might buy a coat, keep it for 3 or 4 years. So if you're a coat company, you've sold all the coats you can for this year, and you may not have a good market for a few more years. In maternity wear, myself, most women I know who've had children, a lot of your maternity clothes, they're given to you by your friends. When you're done with them, you pass them on because you only wear them for a few months. They're not worn out yet. So there isn't a constant new market. And eventually in 1984, they closed as well. They were the very last. There is an article from the Kansas City Star that we actually have in the museum here, where Phil Jacobs talks about he decided one day he had had enough, and he just walked out, locked the door, and never went back. And in the late 90s, when people started fixing up the buildings in this district and turning them into condos, there is a school across the street from us. There are some restaurants, things like that. And so dumpsters were going up to these buildings, and they were just cleaning out anything left in the buildings. Anne Brownfield and Harvey started this collection. They're the ones who did the oral histories. They're the ones who organized the needle statue here in the Garment District. They recognized that the history of this neighborhood was being lost. An entire industry, once the second largest in our country, and 12 years later after the last business, half of Kansas City had no idea that it had ever even been here. So they started collecting. They started literally climbing into dumpsters and pulling things out, doing the oral history, saving this, and then they managed to start this museum here. They ran it for a while, but they needed to retire eventually. In 2015, Harvey has passed away. Anne is still living, but they're retired. She needed to retire. And they decided to give this collection to the Kansas City Museum. And I think some of the reasons for making that decision, Kansas City Museum, we already tell the history of Kansas City and the surrounding area. That's what we do. We also have one of the largest clothing and textile collections anywhere, but certainly in the Midwest. We have over 20,000 items of clothing and textiles and accessories and things. So adding their 320-piece clothing collection, it's a very natural fit for us. And it is very important for us to preserve as much as we can of this particular museum. And that's why we are doing this video. So we have a video reminder, a video walkthrough of the museum as it is now. Eventually, we will open a gallery. We will include this story in our main Kansas City museum. But our moving from here was unexpected. It was out of our control. The building was being sold by the owners. And so we don't immediately have an exhibit space where we can just go and take this whole exhibit and translate it over there. It's going to take some time to develop it, make it fit into the space. I have 23-foot ceilings here in the Garment District, and we don't have that where we're going. So there's a combination of things, but we really want to preserve this history because it is very, very important to Kansas City. It's sad that we're not going to be able to be actually in the Garment District anymore, but that may change. We may have a space open up for us down here again, and if that happens, it will be great to bring the Garment Museum back to the Garment District.